In September of 2001, engineers are only weeks into building an 11-kilometer breakwater in the Arabian Gulf, the first stage of the most ambitious artificial island ever attempted, when the September the 11th attacks unfold half a world away in New York. In the immediate aftermath, tourism and business across Dubai are hit sharply. Beaches empty, hotels sit vacant, workers are warned to stay out of Western hotels and bars, and some of the 1,200 foreign engineers on the project quietly make contingency plans to leave the country altogether. The island under construction exists for one major reason: to create the beachfront Dubai needs as it diversifies beyond its limited oil revenues. Stick around, because building an island in the shape of a palm tree, entirely out of sand and rock, in open water, on a tourism bet, hit by a global shock almost as soon as construction began, turned into one of the strangest and most audacious construction projects on Earth. By the early 2000s, Dubai's leadership could see the problem clearly. Unlike its oil-rich neighbors, the Emirates' own reserves were modest, and its leaders knew oil could not support Dubai's future indefinitely. Its entire coastline stretched barely 70 kilometers, not nearly enough beachfront to support the mass tourism industry. Its ruler, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, wanted to build. He had already tested the strategy once with a sail-shaped luxury hotel built just off the coast that had put Dubai on the map for high-end travelers. And he wanted to scale that same bet up dramatically, from roughly 3.5 million visitors a year toward an eventual target of around 15 million. His solution was blunt. If the coastline wasn't long enough, build more of it, out in the sea itself. The first proposal that landed on his desk was a straightforward circular island, adding a respectable 7 kilometers of new beach. Sheikh Mohammed rejected it outright and reportedly asked why the project couldn't add 10 times that much instead. Engineers went back to the drawing board, and this time someone landed on the shape that would define Dubai's skyline for a generation: a palm tree, chosen partly because the date palm is a national symbol of the UAE, and partly because its fronds could squeeze an enormous amount of extra coastline into a relatively compact footprint. Developer Nakheel commissioned an American architecture firm to turn the concept into a buildable master plan, and the final design, a central trunk branching into 17 fronds and wrapped in a protective crescent-shaped breakwater, would add roughly 60 to 70 kilometers of new waterfront, depending on how you measure a coastline this jagged. There was another catch. A project of this scale would ordinarily take far longer to plan and build properly. Sheikh Mohammed pushed the reclamation and first residential phase toward a roughly 5-year timeline. There was one non-negotiable condition attached to the design: to keep the island feeling like a natural extension of the coast rather than an industrial structure. The reclaimed island itself would be formed from sand and rock rather than a giant concrete platform. That single requirement turned what should have been a fairly conventional land reclamation job into something nobody had attempted at this scale before. Before anyone could pour, spray, or stack a single grain of material, engineers first had to answer a harder question. How big a seawall would it actually take to keep an unsupported sand island from simply washing away? Teams modeled decades of regional storm data, wave heights, tidal surges, and the seasonal shamal winds that sweep down from Iraq every winter, along with the theoretical worst case, a storm severe enough to strike only once a century. The Gulf turned out to work in the project's favor, shallow at an average depth of only about 30 meters, and too narrow for the kind of monster waves that build up over open ocean. Even so, the final calculations called for a breakwater standing several meters above the waves and stretching more than 11 kilometers around the island's perimeter. Work began in earnest in the middle of 2001, starting with the crescent-shaped breakwater that would eventually shield the whole island from the Gulf. Roughly 7 million tons of rock, quarried across the northern Emirates, was trucked to the coast and shipped out to sea, where the rocks were lowered into place by crane and the underwater structure checked by divers as construction progressed. The base layer was a water-permeable fabric membrane covered in 1-ton rocks, topped by 2 more layers of armor stone weighing up to 6 tons apiece, engineered to absorb the force of storm waves without a drop of concrete holding any of it together. It was dangerous work. During construction, a wave swept several workers off the breakwater, and at least 1 man drowned. While the breakwater rose, a second team tackled the island itself, dredging roughly 100 million cubic meters of sand from the seabed several miles offshore and spraying it into shape through a technique called rainbowing, arcing it out of the pipe like a fountain to settle into the outline of the palm below. Desert sand, oddly enough, was useless for this. Its grains were too fine and round to lock together, so everything had to come from coarser sand dredged out at sea instead. There was no mold to follow and almost no straight lines anywhere in the design, so survey crews walked the shifting outline of the island every day in summer heat, pushing past 45 degrees Celsius, carrying GPS receivers on their backs to keep the dredgers spraying sand within about a centimeter of the plane. Divers checked underwater structures, while satellite imagery was used periodically to confirm the growing island matched the design from above. As testing and construction progressed, engineers discovered that the solid crescent restricted water circulation more than desired, and the lagoons between the fronds were at risk of turning stagnant and green. The fix required cutting 2 large openings straight through the breakwater itself, allowing tidal exchange to refresh the water inside the palm roughly every 2 weeks, a correction made mid-build without slowing the rest of the project down. Loose reclaimed sand brings its own hidden danger. Under the right conditions, an earthquake can cause saturated sand to behave almost like a liquid, a phenomenon called liquefaction, capable of causing severe settlement and lateral spreading across reclaimed waterfront areas, as engineers had watched happen around the harbor at Kobe, Japan, in 1995. With the Gulf region occasionally rattled by earthquakes from neighboring Iran, Palm Jumeirah's engineers weren't willing to take that risk. Specialized rigs drove water-assisted vibrating probes deep into the reclaimed land across the entire island, shaking the surrounding sand until it packed down dense and firm, a process that took months to complete across every single frond before a single foundation could be poured on top of it. Only once the foundations were solid could construction actually begin on the city itself. Roads, power, water, sewage, and eventually thousands of villas, apartment towers, and hotels, brought in by thousands of workers, drawn overwhelmingly from South Asia and bussed onto the island in round-the-clock shifts through brutal desert heat, for wages and working conditions that drew criticism from labor rights groups even as the island itself became a byword for luxury. A 6-lane tunnel connecting the island's trunk to its crescent was driven 25 meters beneath the water, built by first damming off a section of sea with 2 long temporary walls and pumping it dry so crews could excavate and pour the crossing in the open air rather than underwater. An elevated monorail eventually stretched the length of the palm to ferry visitors from the mainland, floating over open water on its final approach to the crescent. When roughly 4,000 villas and apartments went on sale in 2002, they reportedly sold out within 72 hours, and by the time residents began moving in around 2006 and 2007, the island's roster of homeowners already included a scattering of international celebrities and professional athletes drawn by the novelty of owning a house shaped, quite literally, like a leaf on a tree. The island's signature address turned out to be a hotel. Atlantis the Palm, a 1,500-room resort built around an Atlantis mythology theme, opened at the tip of the crescent in September of 2008, developed jointly by hotelier Sol Kerzner and a Dubai government investment arm at a cost of around $1.5 billion. Inside, a sprawling aquarium eventually housed more than 65,000 marine animals across dozens of tanks, part water park, part public spectacle. Its opening party alone reportedly cost somewhere between $20 and $28 million, with a headline performance by Kylie Minogue and an enormous fireworks display. It also opened at possibly the worst possible moment. The global financial crisis hit within weeks, and leaked figures soon showed room rates and occupancy plunging on some nights. Long before the hotel opened, the Breakwater itself had quietly become an attraction of its own. In 2004, to help kickstart marine life around the new structure, developers deliberately sank a pair of retired fighter jets onto the seabed to serve as an artificial reef, giving local fish and coral something to colonize, a small experiment that would end up shaping how the island's marine environment was managed for years afterward. That crisis rippled through Dubai's entire building boom. Nakheel, the government-backed developer behind Palm Jumeirah, was part of the sprawling Dubai World conglomerate, which by late 2009 found itself unable to keep up with tens of billions of dollars in debt, triggering a crisis that rattled property markets well beyond the Gulf and forced neighboring Abu Dhabi to step in with emergency financial support. Two of Nakheel's other island projects, an even larger palm-shaped island and an archipelago of islands shaped like a world map, both stalled for years as financing dried up and property prices crashed around them. Palm Jumeirah itself was much further advanced, with residents already living there and Atlantis already operating, and development continued despite delays, though its full completion still slipped years behind the original schedule. None of this came without environmental cost. Dredging and construction disturbed seabed habitats, created sediment disturbance, and altered the natural currents along Dubai's coastline enough to accelerate erosion in some stretches of the mainland shore. In an unexpected twist, the finished rocky breakwater also developed into substantial artificial reef habitat, supporting fish communities with densities comparable to nearby natural reefs. The island isn't perfectly static either. Like other reclaimed land, Palm Jumeirah experienced some initial settlement, but claims that the island is steadily sinking have been disputed by both the developer and the satellite mapping company involved. What's not in dispute is the scale of what actually got built. A 5-kilometer by 5-kilometer archipelago holding tens of thousands of residents today, spread across a trunk, 17 fronds, and a crescent that alone stretches longer than 11 kilometers. The island is clearly recognizable in photographs taken from the International Space Station. So here's a question worth sitting with. This was a roughly 5-year sprint to build the first residential phase of an entire artificial city, on sand, in open water, funded by an emirate betting heavily on tourism and real estate as it diversified beyond oil. A project hit by a global tourism shock almost as soon as construction began, and later tested again by the financial crisis. Looking at Palm Jumeirah today, does it look like a triumph of engineering ambition, or a reminder of how close the whole gamble came to falling apart? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if this look at how Dubai built an entire island out of nothing but sand and rock gave you a new appreciation for the engineering hiding under all that luxury, give this video a like, subscribe for more deep dives into the world's most audacious construction projects, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.